Okay. So the rest of the session today, I think we're going to talk about my like political background and political opinion. I think it's important at the outset here to say that I recognize that I have for a long time been influenced by largely conservative thought. And getting into my adult life, disconnecting from a lot of the community that I had also meant exploring a lot of different political ideas. So again, I just kind of want to talk through that and talk through that development. Um, I had shared, I think I shared this in the very first session, but I've also shared this, privately besides. In 2015, when I was 19, I voted for Donald Trump in the presidential election. And I'd like to reflect on that a little bit, but I'd also just like to talk about kind of what happened since.
Right.
Since that point, I've recognized that that decision was not wise, or at least I don't feel that it in retrospect, is what I would rather have done.
Okay.
Um, but I also spent the next couple of years pretty tied into, that kind of thinking. I was a worship pastor at a church that didn't necessarily hold exactly those ideals, that weren't necessarily conservative. I think it's very important not to conflate those two things and say that Christianity and conservatism are in any way the same. Um, but I was still part of an environment that largely thought a particular way. Um, and so I think the hope here is to kind of explore how that has like changed and adjusted and where those ideas kind of picked up and left off for me.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Um, yeah, Joe. So, I mean, why don't we? Yeah, let's dive in. I mean, I think based on your notes and what you just said, I mean, you tell me, but why don't we start with a little bit of that, like regret, as you're reflecting on it,
Yeah.
and maybe that gets us down that path of where you're
Yeah.
coming to.
I think I've thought about this a lot. That decision to vote for Trump in 2015 and what that meant for me. Thinking back to myself in that time, I was 19 years old. I
Uh-huh.
was attending Bible college. My dad was still a professor at that particular university, and as far as I remember, was still a pastor at the time. I was very heavily tied into a religious community. And thinking back on it, I don't know that I ever heard a lot of, contradictory thought to him and to his ideas. What I did hear didn't really hold water for me. I remember very distinctly watching a video from a news source that took some phrases from a speech of his, and it felt to me like took them to some degree out of context.
Mm-hmm.
It was a speech, pretty famous one at this point. They're not sending their best was the was the thing, and I remember again just seeing that at 19 and looking at the little clips that were shared, then going and watching the whole speech, and recognizing that it was not entirely the same thing what they were saying. I don't know that it was really materially wrong, but it was different enough that I said, I don't know that I can really trust that.
Yeah.
So, without a lot of contradictory statements, and admittedly, without me really going and pursuing much contradictory to him and to, what he was saying, I thought, it seems like given the choice between him and the other person who's running, uh, it seems like he's a little more interested in the success of, the nation, that he's a little bit more focused on what's best for us. In retrospect, I recognize a lot of that came down to me not exploring different ideas, different opinions, me deferring to authority, and at the same time, not really engaging and not really trying to make a very conscious choice. It's one of the things I'm fearful about in discussion, because I've had people tell me that I had one person literally tell me that blood was on my hands for that decision. And man, like, I feel it. I don't know that I feel necessarily that level of severity, but at the same time, I feel what people are talking about when they say, look, like, there was harm done as a result of this. Now, in reflection, at the same time, Washington State was never going to be a mechanism for him to be elected. And so I take a little solace in that that single vote was not an influence on the results of that particular election. At the same time, I feel it very necessary to own that choice and to own the consequences of that choice for me, for my sense of morality, for my sense of values, right? Um, I'm doing my very best here to reflect openly on this. I do feel that it was a mistake.
Mm,
In reflection, I don't feel that I could have or would have done anything differently. And it's important to, I think, maintain that duality, I guess.
sure.
You know, yeah.
No, and again, 100. I just can't speak enough about how much I think the openness and the vulnerability is appreciated here, right? And look, we all make mistakes. We're humans.
Mm-hmm.
We're not perfect creatures, right? And I think the most important thing and the things that the best individuals out there from are reflect and learn from those mistakes, right? And I think that's kind of where I want to go next, Joe. Is like, I guess, 19-year-old totally understand the environment that you're in. Like, to me, I get it. I see how you went out and made that vote, right? Like, I don't blame you. I think you made a decision based on the information and the influence and the people that you were surrounded by, right? And again, but like, talk to me about that shift. Like, what was it during his presidency? Was it afterwards? Like, how did you come to that? And then, was it a drastic shift to the other side? Was it a gradual? Talk to us about
Sure.
that.
Sure. So first, on the shift in my perspective towards him,
Yeah.
um, I think I started to recognize a few years into his presidency that I couldn't trust what he said and did.
Mm,
Trust for me is hard because I do operate largely on the assumption that people have good intentions. And I've been very, open about that as well, that I tend to enter conversation with people, even though I know I disagree with them on things, on the belief that they have good intentions, that they mean the best. Over the course of Trump's presidency, I started to recognize that what he said and what he did were fluid. That he was not somebody who stuck to his guns on particular things. To use a figure of speech, right? He was not somebody who held an opinion and stood by that opinion.
nope.
And while I understand the challenge of being the president of a nation as diverse as the United States, it was very frustrating to me to see those active contradictions. More than that, it was very frustrating to me to see his response to people who knew what they were talking about and his willingness to speak on subjects that he did not know much about. Um, I just started to recognize that he was not a person that, on a personal level, I respected and I wanted to listen to. Um, it's not necessarily that I started to think of him as evil. As I feel many people do think, Donald Trump is an evil person. I look, I think it's very easy to summarize an individual with a word like that and characterize them a particular way, and I just recognize that it's more complicated than that, right? But
Sure.
at the same time, he no longer appeared to me to be a leader that I wanted in charge.
Yep.
My dad and I have a podcast episode where my dad actually wrote his master's thesis on why Donald Trump won in 2016 and why he lost in 2020, and we had some open discussion about that. Um, and it seems as though part of the reason that he lost in 2020 is that whoever the people who saw him as that leader started to become disillusioned and realized that maybe he was not everything that he said he was. Um, Now, in terms of how I started to change in my own opinions, besides, right, I do think that I swung pretty far to the other extreme for a little while. But before I move on to that, any questions or follow up on the subject of like Trump and that perspective?
No, I think you've done a really good job of framing your mindset and the reasons behind the decision and the shift. I can't promise that I won't come back to it once
Sure.
we get into this next part, but I feel good right now.
Okay, cool. Well, so yeah, so let's talk then about kind of the progression of my political thought, right?